This week's US CQM Forecast Alert is judging the current economy based only on GDP is highly risky. The real GDI growth rate is 4.78% for 2025 Q2, which is about 1.5% higher than the real GDP growth rate of 3.29%. And imported goods rose 7.07% in July, significantly exceeding the ADIMA forecast. The graph shows the growth rate of real GDP, GDI, and GDO, as well as the difference between GDP and GDI from 2000 Q1 to 2009 Q4. GDO is gross domestic output, which is the average of GDP and GDI. In theory, these economic growth rates should match, but in reality, they don't match due to the differences in basic statistics and etc. There are only a few quarters in which the growth rate of GDP and GDI have been very close. Even during the period from 2010 Q1 to 2019 Q4, there were few cases where the growth rate of GDP and GDI matched on a quarterly basis. Looking at the long-term period from 2000 Q1 to 2025 Q2, the economic growth rate is roughly the same at 2.27%, whether measured by real GDP or real GDI. However, the average absolute differences in the growth rate of real GDP and real GDI for each quarter is 1.87%, nearly 2%. This means that relying solely on GDP to judge the current economic situation increases the risk of making an incorrect economic assessment. For this reason, the Council of Economic Advisers recommend GDO as a better indicator of economic growth rate. In other words, GDI nowcast along with GDP nowcast are essential for making correct economic assessments. On the expenditure side, real GDP was revised downward to minus 0.06% due to a sharp increase in imports, and on the income side, it was revised downward to 1.39% due to an upward revision of the GDP price deflator. As a result, the average economic growth rate on both the expenditure and income side was 0.66%. The CQM indicates that economic growth in 2025 Q4 appears to bottom out, but the economic growth rate remains low at around 1% on both the expenditure and income side. Regarding inflation for 2025 Q3, headline and core PCE inflation have been revised downward slightly, while the GDP price deflator has been revised upward as a result of a significant increase in imports. The inflation rate for Q3 is forecasted to be 2.4% to 3.0%. about 0.5% higher than in Q2. Inflation is expected to stabilize at around 2% in 2025 Q4, about 0.5% lower than in Q3. Given the slowdown in the economy and stabilization of inflation in Q3 and Q4, the policy interest rate is likely to be cut at the September FOMC meeting, as cautiously suggested by Fed Chairman Powell at the Jackson Hole Summit. Conclusion from this week's US CQM Forecast Alert. The first, relying solely on GDP to judge the current economic situation increases the risk of misjudging the economy. The second, the economy should be considered from at least both the expenditure and income sides. It is recommended to use both GDP nowcast and GDI nowcast. The third, the economy is expected to slow to around 1% in 2025 Q3 and Q4 compared to the high growth seen in 2025 Q2. The fourth, the inflation rate for 2025 Q3 is predicted to be 2.4% to 3.0%, about 0.5% higher than in Q2. However, it is expected to fall to around 2% in Q4. There are no signs of accelerating inflation. The fifth, as Fed Chairman Powell indicated at the Jackson Hole Summit, the Fed will likely cut interest rate by 50 basis points at its September FOMC meeting. This slide contains additional information about this week's detailed CQM forecast.